And you ask the question, why are Gazans willing to sacrifice their own children? It's religious. This is a religious war. This is not a war for national liberation, as is claimed. It's not a war for land. It's a religious war. And their religious fanaticism causes them to even sacrifice their own children. Those people in the West who think that the Palestinians, the Gazans, are like us and think like us, they're very, very sorely mistaken.
The mainstream media gives you the impression that there is nothing good about America. In direct contrast to that, my podcasts will prove by examples that America has always been and still is the land of opportunity for everyone.
Welcome to another episode in the series Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. My guest today is Richard Kemp. I often spend a few minutes in my introduction going over my guest's background, starting with family, then education, and then career. So let's start with his family background. Richard Kemp was born into a relatively poor family in Britain. Moving on to his education, well, there's not much to tell there either. He graduated from a state high school when he was 17 and immediately joined the British Army. Okay, so you might be wondering, why is this fellow on my show? Well, he's here because of what he's accomplished, despite not having had a proper education. Or perhaps he's accomplished quite a bit because he didn't have a proper education. Well, as you can tell, we didn't spend much time on his early years, and that leaves us with plenty of time to talk about his many accomplishments. After a short time in the Army ranks, he was recognized as a young man who had potential and was placed into Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy, which is the British equivalent of West Point. After graduating there in 1977 at the age of 18, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Royal Anglican Regiment. His first tour of duty was as a platoon commander in Belfast during the 30-year insurgency between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. After serving 7 tours in urban warfare in Northern Ireland, 2 of which were in military intelligence, he was deployed to Iraq, where he served in both Gulf Wars. Then, in 2003, he was assigned to Afghanistan, where he was commander of all British forces there. Among the many things that he accomplished was forming a joint operational group with the U.S. Marine Corps that collected intelligence against insurgents and then mounted raids to capture or kill them. Another example of his many accomplishments is that he was also responsible for an action which successfully prevented a coup against President Karzai of Afghanistan. His final assignment with the British Army was from 2002 to 2006, when he was assigned to the office of the Prime Minister, where he led the International Terrorism Intelligence Assessment Team, responsible for producing national intelligence assessments for the government. At the same time, he was also chairman of the Cobra Intelligence Group that coordinated all of the British intelligence agencies. In that capacity, he worked closely with allied intelligence agencies, especially the CIA, to stop terrorist plots and to interfere with high-profile kidnappings. Upon retiring in 2006, Colonel Kemp was awarded the Commander of the Order of the British Empire, or CBE. It is one of the most prestigious and highest honors given in the UK for outstanding contributions to the country. The CBE was awarded to him based primarily on his leadership in counterterrorism and national security. Another indication of his effectiveness in fighting terror was discovered in Syria. His name was found on an al-Qaeda kill list 7 years after he left the military. They were still after him. Awards from his country and the threat of death by his enemy both stand as proof of Colonel Kemp's success in fighting terror. Colonel Kemp is a frequent commentator internationally, both in print and in the broadcast media, where he is called upon as an expert on defense, intelligence, and counterterrorism issues. He's here today to give us his valuable insights on various hotspots around the world. Welcome to the show, Colonel.
It's a real pleasure to be here, Dr. Bob, and although you touched on and alluded to my inadequate education, one thing you were not aware of probably, though you seem to know a lot about me, is that I went to a high school in Britain which was founded the same year as the current walls were completed around Jerusalem, 1539. And I was officially the worst pupil that school had had since 1539.
That didn't come up in any bios that I checked. Let's start with Gaza, the hottest spot happening in the world today. I know that your first trip to Israel was for leisure in the mid-1990s, and that you've been back many, many times since then, unfortunately not for leisure. You've been there during each of the 5 conflicts between Israel and Hamas, starting with Operation Cast Lead in 2008. When was your most recent trip to Israel? How long were you there? And what did you observe?
I got back from Israel about 3-4 weeks ago now. And that trip was a very long one. I've been there almost continuously since the 9th of October. I went there straight after the 7th
9th of October in 2003?
2023, yeah.
Whoa!
And I went there as soon as the war began, and I've spent most of my time there. I've traveled in and out, but mostly I've been in Israel, and I've been with the IDF inside Gaza. I've been visiting IDF units, having talks with politicians, military commanders, etc. in all of that time. So I've probably got one of the most unique insights, I think, into the way this war has been fought, and I've been able to combine that with my own broader military experience in order to, I hope anyway, to bring some reality to what's going on there, compared and to help counter maybe the lies, the distortions, the untruths that are constantly told about Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the past there were such things as war correspondents, but they weren't there for times like this. For over a year you were there, in and out of course, but mainly spending time there. So tremendous. Now, in each of the conflicts between Israel and Hamas, the media and most of the world immediately criticized Israel for being an apartheid state, for its disproportional response to Hamas aggression, and for intentionally targeting peaceful civilians. Supporters of Israel claim that there's a huge cultural difference between the IDF and Hamas, that in conflicts, the IDF shields its children from harm, whereas Hamas uses its children as shields. Would you say that is generally true? And if it is, why would parents be willing to surrender their children to be used as shields in war?
It's totally true. And only recently we've seen the tragic return of 2 babies, a very young baby and a slightly older boy, the Bibas brothers, who were seized with their parents, dragged into Gaza, held in horrific conditions, and then strangled by Palestinians inside Gaza. I don't know exactly who, but they were. And that's the way that Hamas and its followers treat children, not only Israeli children, but their own children. They're more than happy to see the death of their own children. There's no comparison of any sort between Hamas and the IDF, nothing whatsoever. And I just illustrate that by telling you that something that many people maybe don't know, which is that every IDF medical kit includes a pediatric airway. Now, there's no Israeli children in Gaza. Those are meant to save the lives of innocent Gazan children. And of course, while many other people in Gaza aren't innocent, I think you can say that the children, up to a certain age at least,
could
well be.
Yeah.
And the IDF have saved the lives of so many Gazan children during this war, and sometimes at the risk of their own lives. And not just children, of course. They've done all they can to minimize the deaths of innocent civilians by so many different measures, many of which I've witnessed personally on the ground in Gaza myself. And you know, you have to contrast that with the fact that Hamas want the IDF to kill their children. They want them to kill Gazan children as well as other civilians, so that they can use that to vilify Israel, to isolate Israel, and to bring the condemnation of the world against Israel. And it works. You just have to look at the United Nations, Human Rights Council, General Assembly.
The Pope.
Look at the Pope, a classic example.
The Pope.
The Pope and so many other institutions in the West, so-called human rights groups, governments in some countries in the world, who have condemned Israel, and Israel has, the IDF has even been accused of genocide in Israel, the most obscene accusation I can imagine. It's the opposite of the truth, the total opposite of the truth. And you ask the question, why are Gazans willing to sacrifice their own children? It's religious. This is a religious war. This is not a war for national liberation, as is claimed. It's not a war for land. It's a religious war. And their religious fanaticism causes them to even sacrifice their own children. Those people in the West who think that the Palestinians, the Gazans, are like us and think like us, they're very, very sorely mistaken.
Well, we certainly saw that happen on October 7th of 2023, when not only Hamas soldiers or combatants or terrorists, whatever you want to call them, entered and butchered people, but the population of Gaza next to those communities participated, and most of the deaths were due to the civilians from Gaza who joined the terrorists.
And it's not just, I mean, you're absolutely right, and it's not just Hamas and civilians. Don't forget also, among those people that went into Israel to brutally murder, rape, torture, and kidnap Israeli civilians as well as Israeli military personnel was, of course, UNRWA, the United Nations organization that has become, and for a long time has been, effective an adjunct of Hamas. And so, and if you look at that alone is a horrifying thing to have learnt, the fact that UNRWA has not only taken part in the murders on the 7th of October, but has also harboured Hamas, has covered for Hamas.
They became Hamas. They
are part of Hamas. And so, you know, this is the mentality of so many of the Gazan people. I would say the majority of the Gazan people still support Hamas, despite what they've done.
And they would do it again. There have been surveys by the Pew Research Organization, which is far from being right-wing. And their surveys showed that 80% of the population of Gaza now would say, we want another one. We want to do it again.
Yeah, and that's despite they know what Hamas have brought upon them. And those people who suggest that we can have some kind of de-radicalization program or re-education program for the people of Gaza are living in a dream world. Yes, of course, Hamas have controlled their lives, Hamas have dominated them and have spread propaganda, but it's much deeper than that. And if you look just at the West Bank, at Judea and Samaria, you'll see very similar levels of support for Hamas in Judea and Samaria, who are not subject to the same level of indoctrination as the citizens of Gaza. It's a poison.
It's in their blood.
It is. It infects all of them.
In their blood. And it's part of Islam. In my view, it's part of Islam.
Absolutely. As I said, this is a religious war. Islam, the Islamic teachings do not allow any territory that has ever been owned or run by an Islamic organization to be taken over, to be ruled by non-Muslims. And they are duty bound, they're obliged under their religion to get rid of them. And that's what it's all about. It's about getting the Jews the hell out of Israel. It's not about a two-state solution. It's not about living side by side with them.
Impossible.
They have it's an impossibility. They have no desire for a two-state solution. The Palestinians have been offered their own state
many times.
Many times with maximalist opportunities for them, and have rejected it every time because they don't want a two-state solution. They want the annihilation of Israel.
With regard to casualties in wartime, I looked up the following statistics regarding the ratio of civilian deaths versus combatant deaths. And I did this to dispute the claim that Israel is committing genocide and killing civilians indiscriminately. So here are the numbers. In World War II, the ratio of civilian deaths to combatants, it varies slightly between 2-to-1 to 3-to-1. In Vietnam, 4-to-1. 4 civilians were killed for every combatant. In the Iraq War, 4-to-1. And most recently, the Syrian civil war that started in 2011, 7-to-1. 7 citizens were unarmed, were killed 7 times more than combatants. Regarding the Gaza war, I checked on the web, and the estimates of that ratio vary widely. The Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor reports 9-to-1, but they use the data provided by Hamas, so it's quite suspect. The London-based Action on Armed Violence, an independent organization, reports 2.8-to-1, and the IDF reports 2-to-1. You've been in many conflicts around the world and studied many more. How did the IDF's actions in this war compare to other countries? Does the IDF intentionally target civilians in Gaza, as many claim?
One other statistic as well to add to your list that you gave there is Afghanistan, in which the US and its allies, including the UK, by their own estimates, killed about 5 civilians to every combatant. So not far wide of the average that you gave, but more than many cases. My own estimate, and I've done my own analysis of this as well, my own estimate is that the IDF have directly killed inside Gaza less than 1-to-1. I know that others will say 2-to-1 or whatever. My estimate is less than 1-to-1. I just want to explain that a little bit, and that is that, first of all, the IDF estimate they've killed around about 25,000 or more Hamas terrorists inside Gaza. The total number given by Hamas, which is the only number we have, we can't rely on it, but we've got nothing else to go on, is I think around 45, something like that,
right,
thousand.
I've heard that.
Give or take. But you've got to take from that number
right?
You've got to subtract not only the 25,000 that the IDF estimate they've killed. They don't know for sure, but that's their best guess. You've got to then take away from that the large number of Gazan civilians who have been murdered deliberately by Hamas, and they've taken a lot of people out, and we've seen video of them shooting them in the streets. The number, which is also a large number, of civilians in Gaza who have been hit by rockets fired at Israel but dropped short into Gaza by Islamic Jihad, by Hamas, by other terrorist groups, which amounts to, we don't know how many, but it's going to mount up. There's something like 13% of their missiles drop short and land inside Gaza. And then you've got to take away deaths by natural causes. And according to the statistics before this war began,
yes, good point.
in this period, you'd probably find 8,000 or 9,000 deaths in a population of 2 million from natural causes.
Right.
Those aren't going to stop. So you take all them away, and my guess is it's less than 1-to-1. But to your question, Israel most certainly does not, any more than the United States or the UK or any other Western army, does not try deliberately to kill innocent civilians. They do kill civilians. They do, because if you're fighting an enemy that is hiding among its own civilian population, which Hamas and the other terrorists in Gaza habitually do, it's part of their tactic, then it's not just difficult to avoid killing innocent civilians.
Impossible.
It's totally and utterly impossible.
And it's urban warfare. Unlike World War II, which was in the battlefield primarily, we're talking about urban warfare.
Yeah, and you've got a very dense population there. That Hamas won't let them go. Very often, if the IDF warn the local population by text messages, leaflet drops, phone calls,
knocking on the roof,
right, all of these different things, which they invariably do, or almost invariably do, then Hamas will do their best to stop these people from leaving when they've been warned to leave. And not only that, but there's a bigger problem here as well, which I believe would have prevented some of these civilian casualties. And that is if Egypt had opened its border. Every other conflict that I know of, when there's a peaceful country adjacent to a country at war, that peaceful country will open its border and allow civilians out.
Sure, that happened during the Syrian war.
It happened in Ukraine. 2 million Ukrainians left the country and went straight into Poland next door. 6.8 million Ukrainians left the country totally to other countries. It happens in pretty much every conflict, but not here. Why not? Egypt obviously doesn't want them. We know why, because Egypt has suffered from an influx of Palestinian terrorists before. They don't want the civilians who would be accompanied by terrorists in some cases. They don't want them there. Well, that's understandable. I can see that. But why has the United States, why has the UK, why have other Western countries not pressured Egypt to open the borders? I can tell you the reason why. Because these countries, they want the civilians to stay there. They want to use them as human shields, just like Hamas do. It's their political agenda is not to let Israel win in Gaza, and the way to stop that in their perverted minds, and I'm talking about Western countries now, is to keep the civilians inside Gaza and hope that will deter Israel from continuing its war and winning its war.
Let's talk about proportional response. I'm not a military historian, but it's only logical that if a country is attacked, that it should respond disproportionately. No war in history has ever been won by a tit-for-tat response, right?
There's two facts here, there's two aspects to it. One is the proportional response to being invaded. And don't forget, this force wasn't just a small number of people, it was a very large trained military force out to murder and massacre and kidnap as many as they could. And the force that Hamas sent into Israel was bigger than the force that the British Army sent to retake the Falkland Islands back in the 80s.
I didn't know that.
It was a more than a brigade-size organization. And so,
5,000 or so?
Yeah, and you have to consider the proportionate response to that. And the second aspect of proportionality is more kind of technical. It relates to the laws of war, and it's often quoted by people when civilians die, and it's the proportional. You have to act in a proportion. You have to act under the laws of war in a proportional way. If you're carrying out military operations where civilians might die, and you make a calculation, a proportionality calculation, in which a commander decides, and I've made these calculations myself. It can either be a commander on the battlefield, it could be a commander back in headquarters, in the Air Force headquarters. You make a calculation. If I hit this target, are there going to be a lot of civilians that are going to die? And if so, is that proportionate to the importance of me hitting this target? And the laws of war allow you to make that proportionality calculation to say, in this circumstance, I believe, say, 10 civilians are going to die, but that's proportionate to the target I'm going to hit. And that's a calculation. It's not a scientific calculation. It's rule of thumb, but it's often mistaken for when people say, I don't know, 75,000 or 45,000, whatever it is, Hamas or Gazans have died, but in Israel it was only 1,200, whatever. And that's the question. That's disproportionate. It's nothing to do with that. But returning to the point you made about a proportional response to an invasion, you're right. It doesn't have to. It
shouldn't be.
It shouldn't be proportionate.
Right.
It has to be
overwhelming.
doing what you need to do
to win,
to win and to remove the threat.
Right.
And that can mean
without any calculation.
No calculation.
Right.
Obviously, you've got to operate within the laws of war in detailed terms, but the laws of war allow you to take effective response, and if need be, as you rightly say, disproportionate response to the threat that you faced. You can do pretty much anything you want within the laws of war to remove that threat from your country.
But given that, why didn't Israel extend its successful bombing campaign in the north of Gaza to southern Gaza? It was doing great, right, in the north of Gaza, and then it stopped the air campaign.
Well, I think the IDF or the Israeli government made the calculation about what it needed to do to accomplish victory in the war against, the possibility of vast numbers of civilian casualties, And it's a political calculation. It's not a military calculation that has been made. And the Israeli government clearly made the decision that they would not kind of, as President Trump said recently, unleash hell. They would be able to accomplish what they needed to accomplish with, let's say, a more restrained approach. And, people can argue whether that's right or wrong. But that's the calculation they made, bearing in mind that Israel has to live in a world that already hates and condemns Israel for even the slightest thing.
Right. So from a military perspective, it would have been right to continue the bombing campaign and kill lots of civilians and lots of terrorists. In World War II, we certainly bombed civilian areas. We bombed Dresden, right? We bombed Hiroshima. How many Japanese were guilty, were military people in Hiroshima? Not many of them.
Yeah, you've got it's another calculation that you've got to take as well, which people very often forget, is not just the civilians are going to die, the enemy fighters are going to die, but also your own soldiers that are going to die. They're human beings as well. They can't just be ignored, and you can't. And indeed, that's the reason why President Truman made the decision to
bomb Hiroshima
for the nuclear attack on Hiroshima, because he calculated, or his experts calculated, that 1 million American soldiers would die if the Japanese homeland had to be invaded.
Right.
And so it was, and not only that, but even more. I think 1.5 or 2 million Japanese would die in the invasion if it took place. So the logical and the obvious thing to do was to hit it with nuclear bombs. But of course, that's not understood today.
Right.
Or
it's
people don't want
to. If we kill one of yours, you can kill one of ours. So Israel entered into a ceasefire agreement with Hamas on January 19th. From a military perspective, when one party in war is clearly winning, it's not logical for it to agree to a ceasefire. So why do you think Israel agreed to the ceasefire in the first place, especially when Trump was about to become president the very next day on January 20th?
Well, I agree it's a very tough thing to do, and from a military perspective, it wasn't the right thing to do. But again, there are wider issues, and in particular, the prospect of getting some of the hostages released. Now, the hostages inside Gaza are very, very important to the Israelis, and there's a great deal of political pressure on the Israeli government to get as many of them back as they possibly can. And I think that's the reason why Israel agreed to a ceasefire, in order to get as many of those people out of Gaza as they possibly could. Now, that obviously has to be balanced. A relatively small number of people, although in horrific conditions, being held captive inside Gaza against the overall security of the 7-8 million, whatever Israelis make up the population of Israel. So that's got to be balanced.
And taking into that equation the number of terrorists who are in Israeli jails for serious crimes, some of them for murder, and on life sentences that Israel is letting go.
Yeah, and again, it's a very painful decision, I think, for the government to take in Israel to do that. My only hope is that they've made plans to hunt them down and get rid of them subsequently. But I believe, without a doubt, that as soon as the Israeli government calculates that it has got as many hostages out as it can, and I don't believe they will all come out. I think it's certainly not in Hamas' interest.
I'm going to ask about that. That's right. I'm going to go into that.
Yeah. But once the Israeli government decide they've got all out that they can, then they should go back in and unleash hell on Gaza. Ideally, get the population out first, but that looks unlikely to happen.
Unlikely.
Otherwise, Hamas have to be dismantled. Hamas is a monstrous organization. Israel cannot live alongside Hamas any longer, and it has to get back in there and completely annihilate Hamas, which, by the way, in my opinion, is entirely possible. Painful, difficult, but possible.
But isn't it obvious to me that Hamas will never release all of the hostages? Because if they did, then they don't have any cards, and the IDF will be free to immediately and dramatically increase its war effort and wipe out every member and supporter of Hamas. So given that Hamas will continue to hold some hostages, even one hostage, what will it take for Israel to go back on the offensive and restart the war with a vengeance to achieve its prime objective of eliminating all of Hamas. What do you think it'll take?
Well, you're absolutely right that, and it's a terrible thing to think or say, but it's the reality that Hamas is not going to release all of the hostages. They're the most powerful bargaining chip they've got. Without them, they're finished, totally finished. And so I think, again, going back to what I said before, I think the calculation is one that can only be made by the Israeli government to decide at what point we don't believe we're going to get any more hostages out and we go back in. And can't really be an open-ended situation, because for Israel, this war shouldn't drag on any longer than it already has, or much longer. And so they will need to go back in. And unfortunately, the remaining hostages, those who are alive, and I don't think there are very many, from my understanding, that are still alive.
About 20, I think.
Yeah, I think something like that I heard. So the IDF will have to go in, and unfortunately, many of those hostages will die with their Hamas and other Gazan captors.
You know, Israel has been through this before. I forget how many years ago it was, maybe 10, 15 years ago, when Hamas had a hostage, Gilad Shalit. And I think he was hostage for a long time. And Netanyahu was prime minister at the time, and he agreed to release over 1,000 Hamas terrorists who were in jail, many with blood on their hands, as they say, convicted and life imprisonment for murder, for terrorist acts. He released over 1,000 terrorists in exchange for Gilad Shalit. And I think that sets the wrong standard. Once you stop being willing to negotiate to save a person or 10 people or 100 people, there's no end to it. And it's what's phenomenal about it, what's horrible about it, is one of the terrorists that was released by Israel for Gilad Shalit was Yahya Sinwar, who was the architect of the October 7th massacre. So my view, maybe I'm not subject to political pressure, but my view is you don't negotiate with terrorists.
Yeah, I think in general terms you're absolutely right. And for example, I was involved in hostage negotiations for the British government in the past, with hostages being taken in Afghanistan and Iraq, and our policy was very strictly that we will not make substantive concessions of any sort with terrorists.
It was just money, fine, but to give back murderers and 50-1 or whatever it is.
No, I think it's a terrible precedent to set and a terrible practice to follow. And what it does really is encourage more people to take hostages, not just in Gaza, in Israel,
around the world.
The whole world becomes less safe.
Less safe.
Yeah, but I've spent such a lot of time in Israel. I know Israelis very well, and I can, while I don't necessarily agree with it, I don't disagree with it, I think that I can understand why Israel places so much emphasis, or the Israeli government places so much emphasis on getting their people back. In some ways, they mean that their own people mean more to them than, let's say, if British or American citizens were kidnapped would mean to the British or American government. So it's a terrible thing. It's a terrible precedent. But in many ways, I can understand why the Israeli government decided on both occasions to do that.
Well, part of the reason, I think, is because the left is very vocal, and they threaten with bringing the government down and destroying the country. So that plays a role, and it's a shame. Okay.
It's a terrible thing for the left to do what they've done, which is to use these hostages in a time of war as a lever against the government, when the whole country should be fighting together, unified. Yet they have done their best to bring down Prime Minister Netanyahu, not just on the hostage issue, but it's particularly sickening when they use people who are being held hostage inside Gaza as a weapon against their own government.
Right. And to add to that, in the midst of that, are the criminal charges against Netanyahu, which he had to show up in court during war for a number of days during wartime to answer to some bullshit charges about mishandling, $20,000 or something. I forget what it was all about, but it was really small potatoes. Moving on to speculating about the day after. Of course, the day after Israel eliminates Hamas from Gaza, which I'm confident they're going to do. They have to do. So what do you think about President Trump's statement that the Palestinians should be moved out of Gaza, after which the U.S. would take it over for development to become the Riviera of the Middle East?
I think it was a brilliant plan. And I think whether it comes about, whether it occurs, we'll have to see. But just the fact of doing that.
Fantastic.
It was an act of sheer brilliance, which kicked apart the prevailing narrative
of two states.
Of the two-state solution.
Living side by side.
We had a two-state solution.
Yeah.
Gaza was effectively its own state. We saw the result of that.
Israel was out of Gaza for at least 20 years, right?
Yeah.
Right.
But people tell you that President Trump's proposal of getting the Gazans out of Gaza is criminal activity. They say it's a crime because you're not allowed to compel people to leave their own territory, which actually is not true. In wartime, the Geneva Convention not only allows you but requires you to move populations out of danger. Secondly, people tell you, I think the reality also is that huge numbers of Gazans
would want to go.
They'd be out before you could blink.
Right. They've been paying, $20,000 a person to get into Egypt underground. They pay to escape into Egypt. So if somebody offered them a place to go and transportation and a tent to live in,
they'd be gone.
They'd be gone.
And the other allegation, the other kind of a suggestion that you can't uproot 2 million people, whatever, and send them somewhere else. But it was okay that the two-state solution, under the two-state solution, it was envisaged to uproot 500,000 Israelis
from where they were living,
Judea and Samaria, and send them somewhere else forcibly. Mm-hmm. That's okay, mm-hmm. And it's okay to pull out 8,000 Jews from Gaza back in 2005 and send them. That's all okay, but they're Jews. Mm-hmm. They're Jews, so it doesn't matter. It's okay. But you can't do that to Gazans. Mm-hmm. And the reality, of course, is that, people also tell you that Gaza is an open prison. And the same people that tell you Gaza is an open prison, they want to keep the prisons in there. They tell you Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, but they want the people who are being allegedly genocided to stay and be genocided. Yeah. It's
beautiful.
The logic of these anti-Israel mobs is just extraordinary. But if you look at it from practical terms as well, as President Trump rightly said, Gaza is a demolition site. It's not just so many of the buildings that have been necessarily destroyed by the IDF, because it's impossible, again, like it's impossible to fight within a civilian population and not kill civilians. It's impossible to attack cities without destroying much of it. But it's not only that. There's also going to be unexploded ordnance inside Gaza dropped by the IDF. Hamas have used huge numbers of booby traps, explosive devices in the tunnels, in houses, in the roads. Many of them are still there. They will pose a danger to anyone who goes back, a distinct danger. And on top of it, you've got the tunnel network, which has already undermined so many buildings and will continue to do so. So it's not feasible or realistic or logical to expect people to stay there in those circumstances. And it's going to take 1 decade, maybe 15, maybe 20 years to turn it into a safe place to live again. So what Trump's proposing is absolutely right in practical terms, as well as in terms of, for the first time ever, demand something of the Palestinians. Don't just pressure the Israelis. Don't just demand concessions from the Israelis, as previous administrations have done, but actually demand something
from the Muslim countries,
from the Muslim countries that should be taking these people in, and also from the Gazans and the Palestinians who have never been asked to make any concessions before.
Never been asked to make concessions. You're right. It's always Israel, right? Has to make what do they say? Painful concessions.
Yeah, and all these peace processors who have been running the two-state solution mythology for so long have only ever demanded anything from Israel. They've always sympathized with the Palestinians. They've always tried to give the Palestinians.
Now, how people say you can't take them away from their homeland, but yet we're calling them refugees. Which is it? Right? Yeah. How can they be refugees if that's their homeland?
No, it's another example of the total illogicality of the anti-Israel mobs, which is never questioned. How many, apart from people like you and me and a few others around the place, how many of these peace processes, how many UN Secretary Generals actually question this total lack of logic or any form of coherence to their arguments?
Well, Israel currently has a friend in the White House, but it certainly doesn't have a friend in the International Criminal Court in The Hague. In late November of last year, the ICC issued arrest warrants for both Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant, accusing them of crimes against humanity, specifically the war crime of starvation of the people in Gaza. Those warrants are still active, and they mean that if either of them lands in a member country of the ICC, that they'll be arrested and then put on trial. Given the atrocities that Hamas has committed, Richard, and they've even filmed them and put them online, what's the story here?
By the way, the ICC is a very balanced organization. It also issued an arrest warrant for a Hamas terrorist. The reality that Hamas terrorist is dead, that's irrelevant. I mean, I've never known of any dead person to be brought in front of a court on an arrest warrant, but the ICC do. Well, the reality is that the ICC is a kangaroo court. There is no evidence to back up the accusations or the arrest warrant charges which you've outlined. There's no evidence to back that up. I've been into Gaza. I've seen the way that the IDF do everything they can to minimize the killings of civilians, which I mentioned already.
And delivering food and fuel and electricity. Now, did the Allies do that in Germany? Were we delivering food to Germans?
I've seen the new crossing points that the IDF have opened into Gaza, the roads they've built specifically for the distribution of humanitarian aid. These measures and many more measures that the IDF have taken are unprecedented. I don't know of any other war in which one of the combatants has brought aid into the enemy civilian population in the same place and at the same time as they're fighting battles. It's never happened.
Right.
And frankly, apart from the lies about Israel trying to starve the Gazan civilian population, if you do an analysis of the calorie count that's been shipped into Gaza since this war began, they've received significantly more calories than they ever received before the war started, including aid and their own produce. So any shortage is certainly not due to Israel stopping aid getting in. It's due to Hamas, if there is a shortage. And how many emaciated, starving Gazans have you seen? I've seen none. I've seen no imagery of any. I've seen people who are Gazans who have cancer or whatever have been portrayed as being starving, which they're not. The only emaciated characters, the only emaciated figures I've seen in Gaza are the hostages released on the last bout. And it is sheer lies by the International Criminal Court. And I'll tell you one other thing about the ICC. And I'm very pleased, by the way, to hear that President Trump has sanctioned the officials of the ICC.
And their families.
Give them back what they're trying to give to Netanyahu and Gallant. But one thing you may or may not know is that the chief prosecutor of the ICC, who demanded these arrest warrants, is a guy called Karim Khan, he's Pakistani origin, British barrister, British lawyer. He wasn't going to press for these arrest warrants. I think he had it in his head. He was thinking about doing it. But before he did, he was going to go to Israel. He was going to hold meetings with Israeli government, lawyers, military commanders. He had a visit scheduled. Now, suddenly, just before these arrest warrants were demanded by him, out of nowhere, he cancelled the visit to Israel. And he demanded the arrest warrants be issued. Now, there's a bit of a coincidence occurred here because just a few days before he made that decision, he was accused of serious sexual allegations against International Criminal Court staff. Now, far be it from me to suggest that there was any connection between the two things, but it would be convenient, would it not, to be able to
pressure him,
blackmail him, to put up a one of the
Here's what we're going to do.
One of the greatest, most controversial criminal cases, huge publicity, to deflect from the allegations against him, and to allow him then to say that Israel manipulated these charges, which he has said, which is impossible. But that, again, I just give you that. I'm not making an accusation against poor Mr. Khan, but I think we've got to look.
I didn't hear
surface.
that. I didn't know of that story.
Yeah,
a few days before.
Yeah, right? just a few days before there was a complaint made by an ICC staff member of serious sexual assault by Karim Khan, which is being investigated now. But knowing the ICC, I suspect the investigation might not be too deep.
Now, the UK is a member state of the ICC. So would Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, actually issue an order to arrest Bibi Netanyahu if he landed in England?
He said he will.
He said that?
He said that he would, yes. He said that if before the arrest warrant was issued, he said that if it was issued, he would have to enforce it, which is not true. Although they're a member of the ICC, member states like the UK, I argued against the UK joining the ICC before it actually did, and many other people did as well, but nevertheless we went ahead and did it. But a member state has to satisfy itself, or is entitled to satisfy itself, before it enforces any arrest warrant by the ICC, that there are grounds for that arrest warrant. It doesn't just automatically have to do it. And the British government, the previous government, the Conservative government, that was there until about 6-8 months ago, they lodged an objection to the International Criminal Court arrest warrants against Netanyahu on the grounds of jurisdiction, because the ICC does not have jurisdiction to do what they're doing. What they're doing is unlawful. It's against the ICC's own constitution. But when the Starmer government came into office, they then withdrew that objection. And so the arrest warrants went ahead.
Moving away from problems in Israel, but still staying in the Middle East. In December of last year, just a few months ago, the Assad regime in Syria was overthrown after being in power for more than 50 years. That event significantly altered the political and military landscape in the Middle East. The good news for Israel is that the Israelis took the opportunity to fly 350 sorties over Syria to decimate about 80% of Syria's military capabilities. That's one less enemy for Israel to be concerned with. And in addition, it opens up the airspace for Israel to significantly shorten the path to Iran for what I hope is an eventual strike on its nuclear capabilities. But it might be too soon to celebrate, because the control of Syria is currently in the hands of Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who was formerly a member of the Sunni terrorist group al-Qaeda. And making it even more problematic for Israel is that Julani is being backed with both money and military hardware by Turkey's President Erdogan, an Islamist who is very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. What's your take, Richard, on the situation in Syria regarding Israel?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that the reason that Assad was brought down by Julani and his followers was because of Israel. Israel forced that to happen. They had
weakened Hezbollah.
They severely weakened Hezbollah. They severely weakened Hamas, the other major proxy of Iran. And in doing that, they had weakened Iran itself to the extent that it could no longer prop up Assad. So the demise of Assad, I would put down to Israel. Another.
Give him credit.
Give
credit. Israel credit.
But you're absolutely right to be concerned about HTS, the terrorist group that Julani leads in Israel, in Syria. Rather.
I mean, he's putting on a nice shirt and a nice sport jacket, but that doesn't mean he's not a terrorist.
He also wears a tie.
I saw that.
But he is a terrorist. Of course, he's a terrorist, and you know, okay. Thankfully, as you rightly said, Israel destroyed a huge amount of Syria's military capability, so he cannot use those tanks, those aircraft, all the other assets that Israel destroyed to oppress his own people, and he can't use them against Israel. But I think once he has stabilized Syria as best he can, then he will turn on Israel. There's no doubt in my mind about that. You're right to say Erdogan is behind him. Erdogan is also behind Hamas, as well as Qatar and Iran, and is behind Hezbollah. So I think what as you rightly said, hopefully Iran will be Iran will be subject to serious attack by Israel soon, and that may be followed by a fall of the regime. Whether it does or doesn't, I think Erdogan wants to fill that vacuum that Iran will have left, having with most of its tentacles of its octopus trying to strangle Israel removed, so much of its power in the Middle East removed. I think Erdogan will try and fill that vacuum alongside some of his other allies, particularly Qatar, which is a close ally of Turkey.
Let's move on to another world hotspot, the Ukraine. How many times have you been there, Richard, and when was your most recent trip?
I've been there, I think, 3 times since the war began. And most recently was in the latter part of last year. And in my time there, I've had meetings with Ukrainian government officials, military commanders, and I've visited the battlefronts in Ukraine as well.
Mm-hmm. And what did you learn when you're there?
Well, I think one thing I learned, one thing that I think is relevant to what we were talking about before as well, is how intensive the war is on the battlefield, but how comparatively simple it is. And I don't say that lightly, because no war is simple. Every military operation is hugely complex and difficult. But if you compare what's been going on in Gaza, the immense complexities of fighting against an ununiformed enemy in an area of vast civilian populations, with the tunnels and all the rest of it, to the battlefields in Ukraine, where it's tank against tank, uniformed soldiers against uniformed soldiers, aircraft against aircraft, stuff like that.
Big difference.
It's very, very different. And of course, in most of the cities in Ukraine that have been formed battlefields, the population have left. So you haven't got to worry so much about the civilian population, which is a huge problem. But nevertheless, the casualties have been very much more intense. Far more people have been killed in the battles in Ukraine than have been in Gaza. But beyond that, I think that one thing that I found most striking about the war in Ukraine is that the West has not done enough to allow Ukraine to win. And President Biden in particular, and he obviously, as the leader of the free world, was the most influential. He gave a huge amount to Ukraine, but never enough to allow them to push the Russians back. And nor did he give them enough freedom to use their weapons so they could effectively strike back against Russia inside Russian territory. Now that has led us to a situation we're at today where Ukraine is losing. Potentially, I mean, maybe if the right amount of munitions had been given, if Biden hadn't been so frightened of Putin and his nuclear threats, maybe they could have achieved a lot more than they have. But right now, the Ukrainians are on the losing side. The Russians are pushing not that fast, but steadily forward in Ukraine, and they can't be stopped. They will continue. If they're allowed to continue, if they are able to continue, they will continue. I don't say they'll take the whole of Ukraine, but they'll take much more of it now and kill many, many more Ukrainians, soldiers and civilians that have been killed already.
Now, when the war first started back in February 2022, almost exactly 3 years ago, Putin anticipated a swift and decisive victory. I think they assumed it was going to end in a matter of a few months, but it's been 3 years. So what did Putin miss?
Well, I think Putin expected it to be over even before a few months. I think he expected it just to last maybe a few days. He expected the Ukrainian government to fall very quickly. But he miscalculated, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think you know the way that Russia works. He obviously provided huge resources for the Russian intelligence to assess what the situation was in Ukraine, political and military. But of course, a lot of that money that was supposed to go into intelligence went into the pockets of people at different levels of the intelligence chain.
Kleptocracy.
Yeah. And the same applies to the military. I mean, technically, Putin's military should have overwhelmed Ukraine in a relatively short space of time. But they didn't, because he thought he was, let's say he was sending in a battalion or 10 battalions of fully manned Russian infantrymen. Actually, they were about half strength. They were only half the number he was expecting. Yes, of course, on the books there were the full number, and their rations, their accommodation, their
were
pay
paid for, yeah.
was all paid for by the Russian state, but it went again into someone else's pocket. And the maintenance of the equipment, we saw so many tanks and other armoured vehicles breaking down because they simply weren't maintained in advance of the war. Now, none of that really came as a great surprise to me because when I was serving in Germany with the British Army, I saw units of the Soviet Third Shock Army, which was supposed to be ready at short notice to invade Western Germany. But you looked at their vehicles, you looked at their soldiers. The soldiers were ill-disciplined, the vehicles were rusting, they lacked wheels or whatever on the tanks and on the trucks. Again, for the same reason, because the money wasn't going to Third Shock Army, it was going into the pockets of people higher up. So I think that's partly the reason, at least, why Russia didn't succeed. But I think you also have to give credit to the Ukrainians, who I think have fought very hard, very hard fighters, and ingenious as well. They've developed some of their own weapons, which they couldn't get from the West,
like the drones,
the long-range drones, which have struck deep into Russian territory.
Mm-hmm. So we've spent, from what I've read, about $65 billion over 3 years, and it wasn't a good investment, right?
In retrospect, no, it wasn't a good investment.
We should have either done less or more.
Yeah, either somehow the U.S., and it's only the U.S., you can forget about Europe in any of these terms. The U.S. should have somehow tried to bring an end to this war at a very early stage, or they should have gone all in and pushed, the military might of America. I'm not talking about troops on the ground, but the tanks, the aircraft, the drones, the long-range missiles into Ukraine, which they refused to do. So you can't go halfway on something like this.
Halfway. On the political front, why do you think that Trump recently referred to Zelensky as a dictator, but not Putin? Is Trump taking Putin's side on this?
I wouldn't say so. I think, let's not forget that Trump imposed the harshest sanctions on Putin in his last administration.
Right, that was the last administration.
Right.
So now he's upset about Zelensky, something to do with the rare earth minerals or something he said. It's something like that, right? It seems to be.
I don't know. I don't know if you can, but I can't read President Trump. Right. I don't understand what exactly.
He's pissed off. That's
I don't understand what he's getting at here and what his intention, his plan is. But I do know that the idea that he put to Zelensky about investing in rare minerals inside Ukraine was a brilliant idea. Mm-hmm. It was a phenomenal suggestion, which could have engaged the US with Ukraine economically to Ukraine's benefit and to the US benefit, and would also, because of the deep US involvement that would have brought about, would have been a deterrent to Putin in future aggression. Right, but I can't, as I said, I can't read President Putin.
One of the articles I read implied that Trump wants those minerals not for free, but for the money we've already spent on the Ukraine. In other words, we've already given you $65 billion. We want $65 billion worth of rare earth minerals. And Zelensky evidently said no to that. And that's why Trump's nose is bent out of shape.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But, Trump is going to meet with Putin to start negotiations, I think this week or next week, this coming week. Shouldn't Zelensky be there too? I mean, how can one person negotiate between two other parties?
Well, I think that's not totally uncommon for let's say a mediator of some sort, if you would consider the US a mediator, to engage with
one
both
party
parties
at a time.
Separately.
Yes.
And he has engaged with US is totally engaged with Ukraine ever since this war began. But I, as far as the negotiations, I don't know what's been discussed with Zelensky and Trump or his people. But I think it's not unreasonable to expect Trump to try and push or maneuver Putin separately from Zelensky. I think the idea of bringing Putin and Zelensky together at this stage, it would be unworkable. There is some logic in it.
Agreed. So how do you think it's going to end up?
I think it will end up on Putin's terms. So I think, in other words, Putin will hold on to certainly most, if not all, of the territory that he's already conquered.
Which is about 18%.
Which is around about 18 to 20% of total Ukrainian territory, including the Crimea, which, of course, he took back in 2014. Mm-hmm. So I think that's how it's going to end up, with Ukraine deprived of a large chunk of its territory. Terrible though that is, I think that's the only outcome that can really occur, given that Ukraine cannot push back the Russians. Mm-hmm. The US and the Europeans are certainly not going to put their own boots on the ground to help Ukraine do that, which is about the only way it could happen. So I think the likelihood is either a peace agreement or a frozen conflict for the time being, with Ukraine losing and Russia winning. Mm-hmm. And let's not forget, it's not just Ukraine that loses, it's NATO that loses, because NATO put its, it's laughable to say its full strength, but it backed Ukraine totally. And as it did in Afghanistan, is going to be the loser again, as it did with the Taliban. So that's the unfortunate outcome. But it doesn't end there, of course, because unless the US, I hesitate to say the Europeans, but unless the US can do something to deter Putin,
he'll go more.
He's going to go for more. He's going to have a pause. He needs this pause because he's got big economic problems in Russia. He needs to lick his wounds. He needs to rebuild his armed forces. And then once he's done that, and maybe once Trump is out of office and there's a more malleable president in the White House, if there is, after the Trump period, then I think he will go back. Let's not forget, he didn't touch any other country during Trump's last presidency. He did beforehand under Obama, and he did afterwards under Biden. So I suspect that...
I didn't get that. What other country?
Ukraine.
Oh, I see. Okay.
He attacked Ukraine...
Under Obama. Right.
In 2014, and he then attacked Ukraine again under Biden in 2002. And he didn't touch it under Trump. So I think, whether people
so he didn't expand under Trump, Trump's first term.
Not
he just
at all.
Kept the land he had, and that was it.
And I mean, people, they talk about Trump and Obama being buddy and Putin being buddies. No, I don't know anything about that. But I suspect you're right. But what I do know is that, what I do believe is that Putin fears Trump. And he fears him because he can't predict him any more than you and I can predict him. Right. He doesn't know what he's going to do. And I think one of the greatest attributes of any strong leader is to be unpredictable.
Right.
Not to kind of show all your colours to your enemy or to other potential competitors.
So you think it'll end the borders where they are now, but how do we get Zelensky to accept that?
Well, I think Zelensky does accept it. He may not say it. He sometimes has hinted at it, but I think he probably does accept it. And I think he will have no choice, because if he's seeing his armed forces progressively driven back. He's seen more of his soldiers getting killed. He must know, and his generals know, they can't stop this. And they haven't. I don't like to say this. I don't like it at all. But despite the bravery, the courage of Ukraine on the battlefield, they don't have the fighting power and the strength to push Ukraine out or even to hold them back. So I think whether it's Zelensky or whether the change of government in Ukraine or whatever, I think they will come to accept it. And I think something like, I read a poll recently, I forget the figures exactly, but at least around 50% of Ukrainians want this war to end, even with loss of territory.
And tell me, the territory that Russia now occupies, are they Russian-speaking people?
Some of them are. Some of them in the Donbass and elsewhere are Russian speakers, but that doesn't mean to say they necessarily are on Russia's side. No, I think some of them would, many of them wouldn't. But I think one thing we have to also be aware of is which is often sort of not thought about, is what's going to happen to the people under Russian occupation. We've seen areas of Ukraine suffer. People suffer very badly under Russian occupation since this war began, and indeed before the war. We've seen something like, I forget the figure, 20,000 children kidnapped from Ukrainian territory and taken into Russia.
Why would Russia want to do that? Why do you want to kidnap children? What's the advantage there?
Well, they have a diminishing population in Russia.
Oh, well, that's a reason.
The numbers help them. They claim, of course, it's as we've heard from Hamas. We're trying to help the people. they have the Putin has the same kind of, or Putin's people have the same kind of notion that that in some way they're helping the people they kidnap by taking them into Russia, and and it's mainly children who haven't been heard of since.
Now, I happen to read something about you being involved with an organization that's trying to free those children. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I'm involved with a few organizations in Ukraine and outside Ukraine that's trying to get some of these kids back, and they've succeeded, but on a very, very low level. It's been a very small number.
Now, these children whose parents are still alive?
Many cases, their parents are still alive and living in Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory. And the efforts so far have been I wouldn't say that successful. A lot of people are trying to get them back, but not with a huge amount of success, unfortunately. It's so difficult if you're trying to first of all locate children who in some cases have had their names changed and have been adopted by Russian families, and goodness knows where in Russia. You can imagine the complexities of trying to achieve that.
And then trying to return them to their parents who are in an occupied zone.
Yeah, well, maybe in the first instance, you get them back into Ukraine proper, and then eventually, hopefully, return to their parents. But it's an uphill struggle, shall we say?
Well, Colonel, thank you for spending time with me today, and thank you so much more for having the courage to travel around the world, to visit war zones, and to then report on what is actually happening there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bob. I appreciate your time as well, and I also appreciate all the hard work and fighting that you personally do for this same cause.
In addition to being a commentator on world events, Colonel Kemp is also an author. His bestseller, Attack State Red, is a first-hand account of his regiment battling rebel militias in Afghanistan during the Helmand campaign in 2007. But not to be limited to reporting and writing, Richard was co-producer and military advisor for a Lionsgate movie, I Am Soldier, about the British SAS, one of the most elite and secretive special force units in the world. You can find both his book and his film on Amazon. And if you want to keep up with the Colonel's travels, go to his website, www.richard-kemp.com. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob, please subscribe and you'll be automatically notified of future podcasts in this series.
Thanks so much for listening to another episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. If you enjoyed these interviews with some of today's most influential thought leaders, please follow and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget, you can also watch each episode on YouTube as well. We'll see you next time.